Michael Ungar from the Resilience Research Center at Dalhousie University. I'd like to give you just a few little ideas about how to build resilience. If you're a caregiver or perhaps you're an educator, you're basically working with younger children. And what can we do to actually help them to come out of a pandemic or indeed just in their regular lives, show the resilience they need to get through the next kind of, challenge that they're going to experience? So here's a couple of ideas. For instance, one of the ones that I found particularly useful is when children have the opportunity to experience routines. There's something about the repetitive nature of a child's life which actually sparks a sense of optimism, a future orientation. It's as if the child wakes up and feels totally secured in knowing that today was in a certain pattern, had followed a certain pattern, and because that pattern occurred today, they are very confident that that will also happen again tomorrow. And there's been some great research, even during the pandemic, out of the United States, Laura Glynis's work, et cetera, that has actually shown that when children experience these routines, what they actually find is that conduct disorder drops, anxiety drops, et cetera, and children just feel more secure and better able to cope with any sort of change that's going on around them. So routine is a way of creating security as well as spurring a sense of future orientation and optimism in children, because it kind of basically signals to them that their world is a predictable place. Now, there's other things that we can do. Obviously, a solid and sustaining relationship with us as a caregiver, where there's consistency. Now, even if it's in a situation of divorce or separation, et cetera, what children need is some predictability to those relationships. Now, let's be real clear. We, as adults, do not have to be young children's friends. If you like to play with your kids, that's fine. But what they more need is that security of attachment. They need to know that you're there, that basically when they become dysregulated, there is a wall to push against, a benchmark to sort of anchor themselves to. So that's very much about, sometimes we'll worry that children, if say we're occupied with chores, or indeed as parents, especially during some very chaotic times, we've been very distracted or having to look after other people in our homes, et cetera, we can kind of begin to think, oh, we're neglecting our children. But that's actually not quite the case. What we actually need is a predictability to our relationship, and the children know that when they actually are in crisis, that we're there. But teaching them to, in a sense, self-regulate, to delay connection to us, is not necessarily a bad thing, especially in a world where we know eventually we're going to be putting them into daycares, we're going to be asking them to go to school away from us. So this incremental adjustment to periods of intense connections with us and then some separation is probably getting them really able to have that set of resilience talents, that set of capacities to do really well. But if I might, the other thing which my research all around the world has shown very clearly is that children also benefit from lots and lots of other relationships. It's kind of amazing to me that what we sometimes forget is that as adults or as caregivers, when the world around us is in chaos, as we saw during the pandemic, we also are under stress in our own personal lives. And that I think sometimes it's not realistic to just expect a primary caregiver to be doing everything for a child, when in fact what we know is that there are lots of other people. There's extended family. There are, of course, professional caregivers, children's daycares. There are neighbors. There are older siblings, if that's the case in the house. In other words, I think what we've understood from looking across many different cultures, and my work actually literally takes me, I do research in places like South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, with indigenous and non-indigenous communities in Canada, throughout the United States, in Britain. Wherever I go, what I always seem to find is that children who have networks of other supportive relationships benefit from that. And I think sometimes we forget that we don't want a child to experience that sense of, that the only knee that they can sit on is mine. We really want to to give them that sense that they can drift across the room and find another accommodating space to perch themselves when they're in a crisis, or indeed when they need some attachment or just some cuddling and that type of thing. So all of these patterns are particularly poignant in terms of what we can actually give our children. Now, there's a few others. One of the ones I'm amazed that we often forget is that children, no matter how old, are searching to create, well, frankly, a very powerful identity. It's why they love their Halloween costumes. It's why they just want to be associated often also with, if you've ever seen a 3-year-old that has an older sibling or an older cousin or somebody in their lives, and they'll just kind of, they literally dawdle after. They always are following. They're always trying to be cast in the shadow of someone a little bit more powerful. The whole idea is that what they're looking for through association and through their appearance and through whatever they're doing, they're trying to create an identity. And what children are looking for is something powerful to say about themselves. Now, that's been really difficult during the pandemic when we've taken them out of activities, when we've brought them away from their communities. Because the interesting thing about an identity is, I think sometimes we forget that identity is not something we just cognitively create in our minds. We don't just sit in the mirror and say, oh, every day in every way I'm getting better, or this is who I am. We create identities through the mirroring, through the associations we have with others, so that we're basically, who we are is reflected back to us. That's why I love giving even small children tasks. They love to use the household machines, whether that's a vacuum or a blender in the kitchen or something like that. They love to push the buttons. They love to show that suddenly they're more adult-like, that they're growing up, and to have that reflected back to them. If there's a birthday cake to be served, it should come out on the 4-year-old's hands, so that they feel very much like it's their opportunity to share, to show. There's something about giving them opportunities to just show their talents, whether the child has any kind of it was differently abled, whatever that is. Every child has something that they can show to those around them, where that will evoke a sense of who you are and how you're going to be known in the world is very much about what that world reflects back to us. There are, of course, other things. An odd one, maybe not so odd, but an odder one that we sort of see in our work is, I think we sometimes forget that resilience is also about human rights. It's about fair treatment. I know children, they always say mine, 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 and little kids will say, that's not fair, and they'll, if you're cutting the cake, everything's got to be equal, and there's always that kind of positioning. But equality is foundational to a child's sense of well-being, and to give a child the opportunity, even very young, to advocate, to learn how to advocate, to don't just simply say that's not fair, but then to give them the talents and the skills to sort of say, well, why is that not fair? Or even better, to argue or to go and get what they need themselves. In other words, when a child is given the opportunities to use their talents and treat it fairly, and given decision-making power, if you will, within their age-appropriate space, what a child gets from that is that the world is a predictable, again, space, that the world is just, and that they begin in a very sort of childlike way, but they begin to learn how to speak up for themselves. I want a child to complain occasionally. I want a child to argue for their space. I want a child who is, I know it's annoying as heck. I've raised 5 kids. Believe me, I know it's annoying as heck. You just want them to sit there and stuff, and but the end result of that is a child who's much more likely to advocate when they get into school for a different mark. They're much more likely to, when someone does a slur against them because of their gender, their ability, their age, their race, their ethnicity, they're much more likely to have those skills to sort of talk back. Now, all of these things I've just kind of said to you, they're not simply things that children develop on their own. We have a bit of a myth of resilience that it's inside of us. And whether we're talking about identity or asserting our rights, whether we're talking about finding a network of really good relationships or a secure relationship with a caregiver, whether we're talking about routines, all of these things are things that we as caregivers can influence. Something I've called sort of basically this sort of more social ecologies, creating the right environment to create the right conditions for children to thrive. And rather than just thinking of resilience as somehow an internal quality that is going to awaken, that's not where we're at with the research. I can very clearly say that around the globe, what we see instead is this need to create the right nurturing environments so children, even very young children, thrive. And that, of course, is partly or a large part about how we as caregivers and educators and others in their lives create environments rich in opportunities for them to have those routines and those identities and those relationships and to be treated fairly. And when we do that, developmentally, the pathways and the trajectories go much smoother. I hope that's been a little bit helpful. All the best to you and the children in your life. Take care.